Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome back to this little project of mine to post several tag videos in 1 week. I'm hoping this Tagapalooza will be a good way to celebrate the end of radio silence here on Hannah's Books. Today, I want to answer the spoiler tag put together quite a while ago by Scott and Nell at the great channel Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, which Scott now runs himself. I was tagged last week by the lovely Angelia at Reads and Rereads. If somehow you don't know her channel, I give it my highest recommendation. She is not only extremely thoughtful about books, but funny and charming, and both kind and reassuring in these days when it's helpful to have a source of smart but gentle discussion. Well, onto the questions for this tag. Actually, let me start with a spoiler alert. I'm one of those weirdos who does not believe in spoilers. I don't mean that it's a bad thing to give spoiler warnings. What I mean is that I honestly don't believe there's such a thing as spoiling literature by divulging details. Almost everyone disagrees with me, and partly I know my perspective is partly based on the kinds of books I tend to read. For example, I read a lot of history, and even when I don't know the book's particular thesis, I do pretty much know how events are going to turn out by the end of the book. I also read a lot of memoirs and biographies, where the basic storyline is quite often already known to readers even before they open the book. What we're reading for is why things happen the way they do, or how events make the subject of a biography or author of a memoir feel. Those things are hard to spoil. Finally, I read a lot of backlisted books and classics, especially if I'm reading fiction. And even when I'm reading contemporary fiction, my tastes lean towards books with quiet plots, but beautiful language, or a discussion of interesting ideas, or at least compelling characters. Again, those are aspects of a book that can't be easily spoiled. In fact, I would argue that for most books, spoilers don't really spoil the books at all, at least for me. I'll circle back to some of these examples as the tag goes along. But still, let me reassure you, if you're now worrying that my videos are going to tell you exactly how the movie Psycho ends, or who the killer is in the mystery you're about to pick up, or even that at the midpoint of Jane Eyre we find out there is a in the you can relax. I promise that I am very aware that other people do, in fact, try to avoid spoilers, and I therefore try to refrain from giving them. Actually, that's not always true. Every once in a while, I'll make it very clear in specific videos that I do, in fact, plan to talk about major plot points, especially if I find it necessary in order to talk about major questions or issues the book raises. I don't usually make that kind of video, but when I do, I'll never deliberately give spoilers without warnings in advance. I think that might come up again a little bit later in the video. But more than that, I believe, and I want to argue here, that there are many times that spoilers often don't only not spoil anything, but can actually really be useful and even add some depth to our understanding and our enjoyment of some of the books we read. The first tag question asks us how we define spoilers. I think a spoiler is providing information about a book or other work that might reveal something surprising, or perhaps even just significant to someone who does not know it yet, or at least is not supposed to know it yet. In general, it's not going to be a spoiler to say a Jane Austen novel is going to have a happy romantic ending, or to spell out what happens at the end of Romeo and Juliet. I say that not because Romeo and Juliet is such a classic, and not because it's so old, and not even because the genre of tragedy gives us a pretty good idea about the ending. The reason it absolutely can't be a spoiler is because Shakespeare tells us in the prologue what the conclusion of the story is. Similarly, I don't think it's a spoiler to tell you that Catch-22 is a novel where the central conceit revolves around a catch-22. And it's not a spoiler to talk about the major plot points if you're studying a book in a high school or college classroom, even if some of the students in the class have not yet done their required reading. If we never talk about books as a whole when we're in the classroom, there's a great deal of analysis that just can't happen. But anyway, what I think the term spoiler usually refers to is the giving of that kind of information to folks who intend to read the book and intend to read it fairly imminently. In general, I think human beings as a whole love to know where things are going. We grow to love songs we initially thought were inane just because we hear them over and over. Our attachment to repetition, to familiarity, lies pretty deep in the human psyche, even while we also crave the excitement of the new, of suspense. Children often want to read some books over and over and over again, even when it drives their parents a little crazy. But actually, many adult readers love to reread fairly extensively as well, sometimes for comfort, but sometimes when we know we can continue to grow with a book. Or perhaps we want to figure out why that book continues to live in our head every day, or just why it continues to work for us. I guess when a book is supposedly spoiled for us, it means we can never have that initial naive reading. I don't think it's hard to argue that that is kind of a loss. But it just doesn't spoil literature. There's still so much to find in books on the second reading or the third reading. The novel doesn't get spoiled at all. What does get spoiled is the novelty. Yes? Question 2. And this is where a lot of people might draw a more nuanced distinction. But I'm not sure I'm going to. Does the genre you're reading impact what you consider to be a spoiler? Not for me. Although, again, I recognize that many people would disagree. What about mysteries? What about horror novels or thrillers? I don't read a lot of genre fiction other than mysteries, to be honest, and the mysteries I do tend to read aren't easily spoiled, in my opinion. I read Agatha Christie's Miss Marple novels, not to know who done it, but to spend time with Miss Marple and the people in her community. I honestly don't care if I know who was killed or who does the killing. To be honest, it just doesn't seem like the point most of the time. Even in more heavily plot-driven mysteries, watching how the author constructs the mystery or how the detective figures things out is far more interesting to me than finding out who the killer actually is. And here's the kicker. If you've already read the book and you already know how the plot turns out, you have the ability to pay more attention to how an author makes it all work. And figuring out how authors make their books work is the most interesting part of reading for me. Interestingly, although I think many of us might first imagine that genre fiction is easier to spoil than literary fiction, genres are quite often actually more predictable than literary fiction. In genre fiction, we can often predict what's going to happen in a particular book, at least in a general way, even if we haven't read a single word yet. While there are certainly exceptions, fundamentally, genre fiction more or less has to follow rules of the genre. If you're reading a romance, I bet you'll know by the end of the first chapter or two who the two main characters will be and what their connection will be at the end of the novel. If you read a murder mystery, most of the time you'll follow a basic structure, which the vast majority of other murder mysteries follow. There can be huge surprises within that structure, of course, but fundamentally you more or less have a basic roadmap already in your head. And if you read a whole lot of novels in the mystery genre by one particular author, you might even always be able to figure out who the murderer is fairly early on. There was one classic author, who will remain nameless to avoid spoilers, whose mysteries I decoded when I was a young reader, only because they followed such a clear pattern. The author withheld information about the murderer's own motivations, but told us potential motives for every single other character. Who was the murderer? Obviously, the only character who seemingly had no motive at all and was never suspected. Did it spoil the books for me once I realized how predictable and even formulaic this great author was? Not at all. People read that author and still read that author because it is so much fun to watch the sleuth start to figure things out. What the sleuth finds out seems far less interesting to me than how he or she figures it out, or even their personality. Or sometimes how the murderer managed to pull off the crime and why they thought they could get away with it. The third question, all the best bits are in the trailer, but sometimes the synopsis can be too detailed. Do you research books prior to reading them, or do you go in blind? I usually research books in advance. I read professional reviews, I watch BookTube, and don't turn it off when the BookTubers issue spoiler alerts. And I find out as much as I can about the author's background and perspectives before I even decide what I'm going to read. I always read all the notes on the back covers and inner flaps. If I learn that a particular type of plot point or theme is a big part of a book, it might draw me to a book, or it might occasionally make me reconsider picking it up. To a degree, trigger warnings could warn me off of particular books, but not necessarily help me avoid what I actually want to avoid. I've said before that I don't want to read casual portrayals of violence against women, especially sexualized violence. But a full spoiler would be more nuanced than a trigger warning. If I hear there is sexualized violence, I need to know if the portrayal is an uncritical picture with no analysis, in which case I will probably want to avoid it, or if the book has a more thoughtful discussion, and therefore might be exactly what I want to read. I would only be able to make that decision by hearing a little more of the context before I start reading. And what I'm calling context could easily be seen as spoilery by other readers. Question 4. Sometimes the introduction or translator's notes can spoil the ending, especially for classics. Has this ever happened to you? Absolutely not. I am one of those people who always reads the introductions before I read novels. To be honest, there are times when the introductions don't quite make sense if you haven't read the book beforehand, or if you don't know about it from the larger culture. They might assume readers know certain things and don't explain them, actually, perhaps in a desire to avoid egregious spoilering. But I don't mind having the plot points divulged when it means that the introduction can clue me into the history of the context of the time period and location, and the context of the writer's life, and perhaps the context of the literary movements of the day, or maybe some of the scholarly insights pointed out in an introduction that I can consider as I read. Often these insights are ones I might ultimately question or reject, but sometimes they inspire me to have completely new ideas or interpretations that I wouldn't have had without reading the introduction beforehand, even if the scholar might not have mentioned them. The introduction gets my lit-crit brain warmed up a bit, in other words. Reading with a bit of guidance allows me to see far more in a book than I might see if I read it without the conversation that surrounds it, the conversation that happens in the introductions, that continues in formal book reviews in newspapers and literary journals, and of course the one that happens here on BookTube. Okay, the next question. Name a time somebody spoiled a novel for you. Well, given what I've said so far, you might think my answer to this prompt would be never. But there was one time a friend might have spoiled a book. I've told this story before in a different context, but many years ago, a special friend of mine recommended a legal thriller to me. He promised me that it was incredibly exciting and that I would never, ever guess what the big reveal was. I was about to hop on a train, so I packed the mass market paperback to read while I was traveling. The train pulled out of the station, I opened the cover, And before the train even made it to the outskirts of the city, I knew exactly what the crime was and who committed it. By the end of the short first chapter, it was obvious. Okay, I am not someone who typically reads thrillers, but I've read enough books over the course of my life that I have an idea of how fiction tends to work, and often I have a good sense of where things are heading. As I suspect is true for all of you, it is hard not to pick up on little clues, even if the author doesn't necessarily realize he or she is including them. Anyway, I have sometimes wondered if I had read that book without my friend's challenge, that statement that I would never be able to guess the big reveal, would my brain immediately have done that job so hard of trying to figure it out? Honestly, I suspect it might have, because the genre sets us up to do exactly that. Authors of mysteries and thrillers give out clues along the way, and part of the pleasure of reading those genres is to play detective ourselves and try to understand those authors' clues. When authors withhold clues absolutely completely, making it impossible for the reader to play detective, then there has to be some other strength of the book to carry it through. For example, characters, as I mentioned with the famous mystery writer I mentioned earlier. But for those who do provide clues, we go in with a certain kind of job or goal as we read. I think as readers, we often are really pleased if we figure out the answer to a mystery before we reach the big reveal. I guess ideally, we figure it out very shortly before the reveal, not in the first few pages. On to question 6. Have you ever spoiled a novel for somebody else? I'm sure I have, especially before I'd spent much time on BookTube, when my understanding of what other people would consider spoilers was pretty limited. I never did it maliciously, but that doesn't mean other people didn't feel disappointed. Question number 7. If spoilers ruin novels, are there some authors or genres you can't reread? No, although of course there are other reasons I don't always reread. I don't generally reread a book unless I had fairly strong feelings about it the first time. If I loved it, I'm likely to reread it at some point. And if I hated it, even though I know other readers similar to me loved it, that is when I really ought to reread it. Of course, the main reason I don't reread more than I do is that I don't have time to read all the books I want to read, and I'm not a super speedy reader. Like all of you, well, all but one of you, I have made priorities as I approach my reading lists. The problem is never that I already know how a book ends. Knowing its basic narrative arc is honestly one of the main reasons I do frequently reread, because it gives me a kind of vision that is so far beyond what I might get on the first reading. On a reread, I can appreciate more about how the book works and what the author's doing, and it makes me appreciate it even more, not spoil it. So maybe my acceptance of spoilers is partly a result of my appreciation of rereading. Question 8. When talking about a book on BookTube, are you spoiler-free? Does this limit your ability to discuss? When I hit upon the desire to comment on a particular spoiler in some way, I try to stay vague enough that people who know what I'm referring to will follow along, but that folks who don't know won't feel terribly left out. But I can't always predict what other people will consider spoilers. Is it a spoiler to say that Jo March matures in interesting and not always predictable ways over the course of the two main Little Women books? Surely not. But the specific details of how she confronts adulthood and independence are quite a different question, right? A more complicated question might be, can you spoil a book like Toni Morrison's Beloved? Before BookTube, I would have said absolutely not, but apparently most people think you can. There are times when trying to hide potential spoilers means booktubers just can't talk about certain issues. The place where I felt most constrained was in a discussion of Nella Larsen's amazing novella, Passing. What happens at the end of that story is quite dramatic and something I can understand why many people would like to experience fresh. But at the same time, the writing and symbolism in that section is profoundly interesting, and at least for me, helped me realize some of what Larson had been doing all along, perhaps more subtly. In my video, I think I wound up saying something about wanting people who had read the book to contact me to talk about it via email or Voxer. I think now, after a lot more time on BookTube, I would have just announced that the video would be spoiler-free only up to a specific point, at which time I would warn people and then talk more freely. I mentioned that classrooms are a place where spoilers should be, in general, allowed when talking about books students are supposed to have read already. Book clubs are a similar kind of setting. Although there are always people who don't actually get the book read before the meeting, I think most book club members feel they can talk about big plot revelations if they're relevant to their points. Buddy reads on Voxer certainly seem to follow that same kind of practice, at least in my experience. We're assuming that if people haven't finished the book but do choose to come to the discussion, they won't expect to be protected from spoilers. While I often feel that the BookTube community functions in many of the same ways a book club does, the big difference here is, of course, that we are often talking about books which not all of us have read, and that fact does sometimes limit some of the kinds of topics that make sense to discuss. Well, that is it for this tag. Thank you so much, Scott and Nell, for giving me a platform to speak in favor of spoilers. Honestly, if you haven't done this tag or haven't done it recently, please consider yourself tagged by me. I'd love to see all of you answer these questions. That will do it for today's video. I'm going to try to make a couple more tags this week and maybe a few other kinds of videos soon too. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.